The book hit the pavement with a sharp thud, its raised dots catching the harsh afternoon light as Karen's voice cut through the peaceful park air like a blade. "This is a public bench, not your library." Her shrill tone made nearby pigeons scatter in panic, their wings beating frantically against the sudden violence of her words. Nathan Chen sat perfectly still, his 13-year-old frame rigid with shock. His fingers, which moments before had been gracefully dancing across the Braille pages of The Count of Monte Cristo, now hung motionless in the air where his book used to be. The scratching sound that had so offended this stranger was nothing more than the gentle whisper of fingertips reading words that existed only through touch. "I'm sorry," Nathan whispered, his voice barely audible above the distant hum of traffic. His dark eyes, unseeing but somehow still expressive, blinked rapidly as he tried to process what had just happened. The bench beneath him felt suddenly foreign, no longer the comfortable refuge where he waited every Tuesday for his mother to finish her dentist appointment 3 blocks away. Karen Whitmore stood before him like a storm cloud, her perfectly manicured hands planted firmly on her hips. At 45, she wore her privilege like armor, from her designer handbag to her pearl earrings that caught the sunlight with each aggressive gesture. "Sorry doesn't fix the fact that your scratching was giving me a headache," she snapped, her voice dripping with the kind of entitlement that came from never being told no. "Some of us come here for peace and quiet, not to listen to your finger gymnastics." The irony wasn't lost on Nathan that she was complaining about noise while shouting loud enough to wake the dead. He bent forward carefully, his hands searching the ground for his fallen book. The concrete was warm from the spring sun, and he could feel small pieces of gravel and scattered leaves as his fingers swept back and forth in increasingly desperate arcs. "Don't you dare ignore me," Karen continued. Stepping closer, her shadow fell across Nathan's face, and he could smell her overpowering perfume mixed with the sharp scent of her irritation. "I'm talking to you. Young man, where are your parents? Someone needs to teach you some manners." Nathan's fingers finally found the familiar texture of his book's cover. The binding was slightly scuffed from its collision with the pavement, but the pages seemed intact. He pulled it close to his chest, like a shield, his heart hammering against his ribs. "My mom will be here soon," he managed, hoping the tremor in his voice wasn't as obvious as it felt. "Well, she clearly hasn't done a very good job raising you," Karen shot back, her voice rising another octave. A jogger slowed down as he passed, his expression concerned, but Karen's glare sent him hurrying on his way. "Teaching you to take up public space with your little performance art? This isn't some special needs playground, kid. This is a public park for normal people." The word normal hit Nathan like a physical blow. He'd heard it before, whispered behind hands at school, muttered by strangers who thought blindness was contagious. But never had someone thrown it at him with such venom, such deliberate cruelty. His grip on the book tightened until his knuckles went white. "I was just reading," Nathan said, his voice growing steadier. Something in his tone must have surprised Karen because she paused for a moment, her mouth hanging slightly open. "It's a book about a man who was wrongly imprisoned but never gave up hope that justice would prevail." Karen's laugh was like breaking glass. "Reading. That's rich. You can't even see the pages. Stop pretending and find somewhere else to play your little make-believe games." She reached out as if to snatch the book again, but Nathan pulled it away, his reflexes quicker than she'd expected. The confrontation was beginning to draw attention. An elderly woman walking her small terrier stopped to watch from behind a nearby tree, her face creased with concern. 2 teenagers on skateboards rolled to a stop near the fountain, their conversation dying as they sensed the tension crackling through the afternoon air. "Ma'am, please just leave me alone," Nathan said, his voice carrying a dignity that seemed far older than his 13 years. I'm not bothering anyone. I'm just waiting for my ride and reading my book. Bothering anyone. Karen's voice reached a pitch that made dogs in the vicinity prick up their ears. The noise is disturbing my meditation. Do you have any idea how hard it is to find inner peace with your constant scratching and scraping? Some of us have real problems to deal with. Nathan felt something shift inside him, a spark of anger that surprised him with its intensity. He'd always been taught to be polite, to accommodate others, to make himself smaller so the world would find him more acceptable. But sitting here with his book clutched to his chest, listening to this woman's casual cruelty, something rebellious stirred in his chest. Real problems, Nathan repeated, his voice growing stronger. Like what? Like being upset that a blind kid is reading in a public park. Like being so miserable with your own life that you have to attack a 13-year-old for existing in your vicinity. Karen's face went crimson, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. No one had ever spoken to her like that, especially not a child. She was Karen Whitmore, head of the Riverside Heights Property Owners Association, wife of a prominent lawyer, member of 3 different charity boards. People didn't talk back to her. "How dare you speak to me like that, you little brat," she hissed, stepping so close that Nathan could feel her breath on his face. "I'll have you know that I could have you banned from this park. I have connections, influence. I could make your life very difficult." Before Nathan could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps made them both turn. A tall man in his 50s was walking toward them with purpose, his expression grave. He wore a simple polo shirt and khakis, but there was something about his bearing that suggested authority. Behind him walked a woman with a professional camera, and Nathan could hear the quiet beep of recording equipment. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "I couldn't help but overhear. Is there a problem here?" Karen immediately straightened, her demeanor shifting like a chameleon. "Oh, no problem at all. Just trying to enjoy some peace and quiet. But this young man seems to think the park is his personal library." She forced a smile that looked more like a grimace. "I'm sure you understand how disruptive it can be when people don't respect shared spaces." The man's eyes moved from Karen to Nathan, taking in the boy's protective grip on his book, the slight tremor in his hands, the way he held his head, tilted as if listening for threats. And what exactly was he doing that was so disruptive? "Making all that scratching noise with his fingers," Karen said, gesturing dismissively. "Constantly scraping and tapping. It's inconsiderate, really. There are proper places for that kind of activity." The man knelt down next to Nathan's bench, bringing himself to eye level with the boy. "Hi there, I'm David. What's your name?" "Nathan Chen," the boy replied, his voice uncertain but polite. Something about the man's presence felt safe, like a harbor in a storm. "That's a beautiful book you have there, Nathan. The Count of Monte Cristo, if I'm not mistaken." David's voice was warm, genuinely interested. "One of my favorites. How are you finding it so far?" Nathan's face lit up despite everything that had happened. "It's incredible. The way Dantes never gives up, even when everything seems hopeless. And the way he learns to see the world differently during his imprisonment." He paused, then added quietly, "Sometimes I think we all need to learn to see things differently." Karen made a noise of impatience. "Look, I don't mean to interrupt your little book club, but I was here first, and I have the right to enjoy this space without disruption. If you want to enable his attention-seeking behavior, that's your business, but—" Attention-seeking behavior. David's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. He stood up slowly, his full height making Karen take an involuntary step backward. You mean reading Braille? You think a 13-year-old boy reading classic literature in a public park is attention-seeking behavior? For the first time since the confrontation began, Karen seemed to realize she might be on shaky ground. Well, I mean, he was making noise, constant scratching. It was very distracting. The sound of fingers reading Braille is distracting to you, David repeated, his tone carefully neutral. Behind him, the woman with the camera had moved closer, and Nathan could hear the subtle whir of equipment recording. Tell me, Mrs. Whitmore, Karen Whitmore, and you are... David reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card, which he handed to Karen. Her face went through a remarkable transformation as she read it, color draining from her cheeks like water from a broken dam. David Morrison, Mayor of Riverside Heights. Nathan here is actually my guest at the upcoming Youth Achievement Awards ceremony. He's being honored for his volunteer work with the literacy program at the community center. The silence that followed was so complete that Nathan could hear his own heartbeat. Even the pigeons seemed to pause their cooing, as if the entire park was holding its breath. Your guest, Karen stammered, the business card trembling in her hand. Nathan felt his world tilt on its axis. Mayor Morrison, the man who'd sent him the personal invitation to the award ceremony, the one who'd specifically mentioned being impressed by Nathan's work, teaching other kids to appreciate literature, regardless of their abilities. He'd imagined meeting him for the first time at the ceremony. Not here. Not like this. That's right, Mayor Morrison continued, his voice growing warmer as he looked down at Nathan. Nathan volunteers 6 hours a week, reading to younger children at the community center. He's particularly gifted at helping kids understand that stories can be experienced in many different ways. Through sound, through touch, through imagination. He's taught dozens of children that differences aren't disabilities. They're just different paths to the same destination. Karen's mouth opened and closed several times without producing sound. The business card fluttered in her shaking hand like a trapped butterfly. Mrs. Whitmore, Mayor Morrison continued, I think there's been a significant misunderstanding here. Nathan wasn't making noise. He was reading. The scratching you found so offensive was his fingers interpreting raised dots that form letters, words, entire worlds of meaning. It's no different from your eyes moving across a printed page, except it uses touch instead of sight. The woman with the camera stepped forward, and Nathan heard the quiet click of a voice recorder being activated. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm Jennifer Adams from Channel 7 News. We're here doing a feature story on the Youth Achievement Awards, and we happen to witness this entire interaction. Would you like to comment on your behavior toward this young man? Karen's face cycled through several expressions: shock, embarrassment, panic, and finally, a desperate attempt at damage control. This is all a misunderstanding. I had no idea he was... I couldn't tell that he was... I was just trying to maintain the peaceful atmosphere of the park for everyone. By verbally attacking a child who was quietly reading, Jennifer's question was gentle but pointed. By telling him this was a park for normal people and that he should take his make-believe games elsewhere. Nathan winced at hearing his humiliation repeated, but Mayor Morrison placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Nathan, you handled yourself with remarkable dignity today. I hope you know that Mrs. Whitmore's words say nothing about you and everything about her own limitations. I really should be going, Karen said quickly, backing away from the group. I have important appointments, responsibilities. This has all been blown completely out of proportion. But her escape route was blocked by a small crowd that had gathered, drawn by the raised voices and the presence of news cameras. Nathan could hear their murmured conversations, their sharp intakes of breath as they pieced together what had happened. "Actually, Mrs. Whitmore," Mayor Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of his office. "I think this is exactly the right proportion. A child was harassed for reading in a public park. A child with a disability was told he didn't belong in a space paid for by all citizens' tax dollars. As mayor, I take that very seriously." Jennifer stepped closer to Karen. Microphone extended. "Mrs. Whitmore, you mentioned having connections and influence. You threatened to have Nathan banned from the park. Can you elaborate on what you meant by that?" Karen's eyes darted around the growing crowd like a trapped animal. "I never threatened anyone. I simply pointed out that public spaces should be considerate of all users, not just one person's needs." "But Nathan was being considerate," said a voice from the crowd. An elderly woman stepped forward, her small dog still on its leash. "I've seen him here many times. Always quiet, always polite, never bothering anyone. You were the one screaming and carrying on like a banshee." Another voice joined in, this one from one of the teenagers who'd been skateboarding. "Yeah, we heard the whole thing. She called him names, knocked his book out of his hands. It was seriously messed up." Nathan felt overwhelmed by the support, but also embarrassed by the attention. This was exactly the kind of scene he usually tried to avoid, being the center of a public spectacle, being defined by his blindness rather than by his character. But as he listened to these strangers defending him, he realized something important. They weren't seeing him as a victim or as inspiration. They were seeing him as a person who'd been wronged, and they were angry about it on his behalf. "Mrs. Whitmore," Mayor Morrison said, his voice cutting through the crowd's murmur. "I believe you owe Nathan an apology. A genuine one." Karen looked around desperately, but every face in the crowd was turned toward her, with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright disgust. The business card was still crumpled in her fist, and she seemed to suddenly remember who she was talking to. Of course, Nathan. I'm sorry if I misunderstood the situation. I didn't realize." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence without making it worse. "What didn't you realize?" Nathan asked quietly. His voice was steady now, and there was something in his tone that made everyone lean forward to listen. "That blind people read that we exist in public spaces, that we deserve basic respect." The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Karen had no answer that wouldn't damn her further. Jennifer stepped forward again, her journalistic instincts sharp. "Mrs. Whitmore, according to public records, you're the president of the Riverside Heights Property Owners Association. You've been involved in several complaints about the community center's accessibility improvements, haven't you? Including objections to Braille signage and audio assistance devices." Karen's face went white. "Those were budget concerns. Nothing more. We have limited resources. And we have to prioritize what over accessibility for disabled residents." Mayor Morrison's question was sharp now, his political instincts activated. "Mrs. Whitmore, I'm beginning to see a pattern here that's very concerning." Nathan heard a familiar car engine and turned his head toward the parking area. His mother's Honda was pulling up, and he could picture her scanning the park for his usual spot on the bench. But instead of finding her son quietly reading, she was about to discover him at the center of a media circus. "That's my mom," Nathan said to Mayor Morrison. "She's going to freak out when she sees all these people." Mayor Morrison glanced toward the parking area and saw a petite Asian woman getting out of her car, her expression already shifting from routine to concerned as she took in the crowd. "Would you like me to go explain the situation to her?" Before Nathan could answer, his mother was already walking quickly toward them, her nurse's training evident in the way she assessed the scene, her son apparently unharmed, but surrounded by strangers, cameras, and one very upset-looking woman. "Nathan, what's going on here?" Linda Chen's voice carried the particular tone of a mother, ready to defend her child against any threat. "Mrs. Chen," Mayor Morrison said, stepping forward with his hand extended. "I'm David Morrison, the mayor. Your son handled himself beautifully in a difficult situation today. You should be very proud." Linda's eyes widened as she recognized the mayor, then quickly scanned the scene again, taking in the news camera and the woman who looked like she wanted to disappear into the ground. "What kind of difficult situation?" Nathan stood up, his book still clutched in his hands. "Mom, this is Mayor Morrison, the one who invited me to the award ceremony." He paused, then added quietly, "And this lady didn't like the sound of me reading my book." The simplicity of his explanation somehow made it more powerful. Linda looked at Karen, then at the mayor, then at the camera. And Nathan could practically hear his mother's mental calculator working through the implications. "Someone objected to my son reading?" Linda's voice was dangerously calm, the kind of calm that emergency room nurses perfected when dealing with impossible people. "Reading Braille, you mean? Reading the way he's been reading since he was 4 years old?" Karen tried one more time to salvage the situation. "Mrs. Chen, I think we've all blown this out of proportion. I was simply asking for consideration for other park users. And perhaps I wasn't as clear as I could have been." "You knocked his book out of his hands and called him abnormal." The elderly woman with the dog interjected. "I heard every word. Don't you dare try to rewrite what happened, now that you know who you're dealing with." Linda's expression grew glacial. "You put your hands on my son's book. You knocked it away from him." The crowd had grown to nearly 30 people now, and Nathan could hear whispered conversations, phone cameras clicking, and the low hum of indignation that meant this story was already spreading beyond the physical bounds of the park. Jennifer moved through the crowd with practiced efficiency, gathering statements and contact information. Nathan heard her asking the elderly woman to repeat what she'd witnessed, heard the teenagers eagerly describing Karen's aggressive behavior, heard the jogger who'd initially been scared off now returning to give his account of the incident. Mayor Morrison pulled out his phone and made a quick call. Nathan could only hear one side of the conversation, but it was enough. "Sarah, it's David. I need you to pull all city contracts and partnerships with the Riverside Heights Property Owners Association immediately, and schedule a meeting with the city attorney regarding discrimination complaints." Karen must have heard it too, because she made a strangled sound and started backing away more urgently. "This is ridiculous. I'm being persecuted for trying to maintain community standards. You can't destroy someone's life over a simple misunderstanding." A simple misunderstanding. Nathan's mother stepped forward, and despite being nearly a foot shorter than Karen, she seemed to tower over her. "You verbally abused my child. You physically interfered with his property. You told him he didn't belong in a public space because of his disability. That's not a misunderstanding. That's harassment and discrimination." Nathan felt a mix of pride and embarrassment as his mother's protective instincts kicked into full gear. He'd seen her handle difficult patients and impossible doctors at the hospital, but never had her fury been directed at someone who'd hurt him personally. "Furthermore," Linda continued, her voice growing stronger, "my son volunteers his time helping other children discover the joy of reading. He gives 6 hours a week of his free time to make his community better. What do you do besides complain about children existing in public spaces?" The question was rhetorical, but it highlighted something that was becoming increasingly clear to everyone. Present, the contrast between Nathan's quiet dignity and community service versus Karen's entitled aggression couldn't have been sharper. Jennifer finished gathering statements and returned to the main group. Mrs. Whitmore, do you have any final comment for our story about this incident? Karen looked around desperately one more time, but the faces surrounding her offered no sympathy, no escape route. I think I've said enough. This whole thing has been taken completely out of context. What context makes it acceptable to attack a child for reading? Nathan asked quietly. It was perhaps the most devastating question of the entire confrontation, delivered without anger or accusation. Just genuine curiosity about what possible justification existed for her behavior. Karen had no answer. She turned and walked quickly toward the parking area, her heels clicking against the pavement like a countdown timer. The crowd parted to let her through, but Nathan could hear the murmured comments that followed her retreat. Mayor Morrison watched her go, then turned back to Nathan and his mother. Mrs. Chen, I owe you an apology. No family should have to deal with this kind of discrimination in our city. I want to assure you that we'll be taking this very seriously. Linda nodded, but her attention was focused on her son. Nathan looked drained, the adrenaline of confrontation giving way to exhaustion. Nathan, honey, are you okay? Did she hurt you when she knocked your book away? I'm fine. Mom, just tired. Nathan held up his book, examining the scuffed cover with his fingertips. The book's okay too. Still readable. Jennifer approached them with her cameraman. Mrs. Chen, Nathan, would you be willing to do a brief interview about what happened here today? I think it's important for people to understand the impact of this kind of discrimination. Nathan looked uncertain, but his mother squeezed his shoulder. It's your choice, sweetheart. But sometimes speaking up helps prevent it from happening to other kids. Nathan thought about the other children he worked with at the community center. Kids with various disabilities who were just beginning to build confidence in their abilities. If speaking up might spare them a confrontation like this, it was worth the discomfort of being on camera. Okay, he said quietly. I'll do it. The interview was brief, but powerful. Nathan spoke about the importance of public spaces being truly public, about the difference between accommodation and special treatment, about the way literature could build bridges between different kinds of experiences. He spoke without bitterness, focusing on education rather than revenge. What would you want people to understand about blindness? Jennifer asked. Nathan considered the question carefully. That it's just a different way of navigating the world. I can't see words on a page, but I can read through my fingertips. I can't see facial expressions, but I can hear emotions and voices. I can't see the color of the sunset, but I can feel its warmth and hear the way the world settles into evening. Different doesn't mean less. Mayor Morrison stepped forward after the cameras stopped rolling. Nathan, I meant what I said about being proud to have you represent our city at the award ceremony. But I think, after today, you deserve more recognition than that. Would you be interested in being our youth ambassador for disability awareness? It would involve some public speaking, some community outreach work. Nathan's face lit up with genuine excitement for the first time since the confrontation began. Really? You think I could help other kids? I think you already are helping other kids, Linda said, her voice thick with pride. Every day, in ways you might not even realize. The crowd began to disperse, but several people stopped to introduce themselves to Nathan, to thank him for his grace under pressure, to ask about the literacy program at the community center. Nathan found himself surrounded by neighbors he'd never met, all of them interested in learning more about his volunteer work. An hour later, as the park returned to its normal, quiet afternoon rhythm, Nathan sat on his bench with his mother beside him, his book open in his lap. The raised dots felt familiar and comforting under his fingertips, but the words seemed to carry new meaning now. Mom, do you think what happened today will make a difference? Nathan asked. Linda looked around the park, thinking about the news story that would air that evening, the conversations it would start, the policies it might change. I think it already has. Sweetheart, not just for you, but for everyone who witnessed it. Sometimes it takes a moment of ugliness to make people recognize beauty when they see it. Nathan nodded, running his fingers across the page. The Count of Monte Cristo spent years in prison before he could get justice. I guess sometimes you have to wait for the right moment. And sometimes, Linda added, justice comes faster than you expect, especially when you have people willing to stand up for what's right. As they sat together in the peaceful afternoon, Nathan continued reading his book, the soft whisper of his fingers across the Braille pages mixing with the gentle sounds of the park around them. The scratch and rustle that had so offended Karen was, to anyone actually listening, nothing more than the sound of a mind engaging with great literature, of imagination taking flight, of a young person growing wiser with each turned page. 3 days later, the story aired on the evening news. By the following morning, it had been shared thousands of times on social media. Karen Whitmore found herself at the center of a firestorm of criticism that cost her the presidency of the Property Owners Association, several volunteer positions, and ultimately her job when her employer decided they couldn't be associated with such public discrimination. But more importantly, Nathan's story sparked conversations about accessibility, about the casual cruelty that disabled people face daily, about the difference between accommodation and inclusion. The community center received dozens of new volunteers for their literacy program, and the city fast-tracked several accessibility improvements that had been stalled in committee for months. Nathan became not just the youth ambassador for disability awareness, but a voice for change that extended far beyond his hometown. He spoke at schools, at community events, at policy meetings, always carrying the same message: different doesn't mean less, and every person deserves the dignity of being met where they are. The park bench where it all began became something of a landmark, not officially, but in the hearts of the community. Parents brought their children there to talk about kindness and acceptance. Teachers used it as a starting point for lessons about empathy and inclusion. And Nathan still went there every Tuesday, reading his books in the gentle afternoon light, his fingers dancing across pages full of stories about justice, redemption, and the power of standing up for what's right. Sometimes, the best victories are the ones that create more light than heat, more understanding than anger, more bridges than walls. Nathan's quiet dignity in the face of cruelty had done exactly that, proving that true strength isn't about fighting back, but about standing firm in your truth until others can see it too. In the end, the scratching sound that had so offended one person's narrow world became the whisper of change that opened hearts and minds throughout an entire community.